us in this first part. It's Lindsey German from UK, from Stop the War Coalition, and also active since years in the international network and against Nato and Lindsey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you for inviting me. And it's great to be speaking here alongside all the other speakers. I think that we are in a very, very important time in terms of our campaigning and in terms of what is happening to the world. And I think most of the speakers have referred to already the climate crisis, the pandemic, which we've all faced over the last 18 months, the growth of poverty around the world, all the many issues that we can talk about. I think it's very, very important that we talk about war and militarism as part of this this whole kind of equation and as part of looking at what is going on. And I was asked to speak about 20 years of the war on terror. So it's 20 years now this year since the events of 9/11 and the beginning of the war on terror by the United States and its allies. And I think the obvious thing to say is that we're seeing complete devastation in the regions that have been directly affected by that war. We see in Afghanistan, it remains one of the poorest countries in the world. In Iraq, we still have continuing war. In Libya, in Syria, wherever you look, you're faced with very, very big problems. And I would say when you look at the G7 this weekend, when you look at the discussions around NATO, not only have the world leaders learned no lessons from the impact of these wars, actually what they've done is not just double down on those, on the policies behind those wars, they've also begun to look for plenty of new threats. We've seen this over Russia, where we've had the re-emergence of Cold War that many of us grew up with, but we've also seen it increasingly with China, as a number of the previous speakers have referred to. So I think we need to look at this as something which we are now in an era of permanent war, both hot war and cold war, and a permanent era of militarization. And, you know, if you look at global military spending, has nearly doubled since 2001. If you look at spending in the UK, although it's gone down from its previous highs in 2008, 2009, it's still much, much higher than it was in 2001. It's 48 billion in US dollars as compared to 35 billion then. So we're talking about very, very large sums of money being spent on this. And as a number of people have referred to, the requirement from NATO that everyone has to spend at least 2% of their GDP is having not only a big impetus in increasing this militarization, but it's one which is, as Chloe has pointed out, is unfairly carried by some of the poorer countries in NATO and in the European Union. So if you look at the countries projected to be spending more than 2% of GDP, you're talking obviously about the US, you're talking about the UK and France, which are relatively rich countries, but you're also talking about many of the East European countries, which are much, much poorer, like Romania, the Baltic states, Poland, and Greece as well. So you're talking about countries where already we're talking about relative levels of poverty, lack of infrastructure and all sorts of other things, and you're talking about much more spending on the military rather than on health, education, dealing with climate change, or any of the issues that I guess most of us would regard as much, much more important in terms of people's welfare and in terms of people's well-being. And we've just had the G7, as Kate described, and I think Kate and the people who demonstrated in Cornwall did a fantastic job of highlighting the issues. And it wasn't easy because of the level of police repression in particular, and the refusal to allow demonstrators close to the actual site of the summit. We also had a demonstration in London, which was in defence of the Palestinians, which was also very important in terms of highlighting this issue for the G7. But if you look at the G7, what do you find? 2 days ago, 3 days ago, you had this new Atlantic Charter, so-called, between Biden and Johnson. And this was meant to echo the Atlantic Charter between Roosevelt and Churchill in the usual, yet another attempt by the British government to hark back to its sort of fading imperial glory and to try to evoke memories of this kind of thing. And actually, if you look at this charter, it is about commitment to nuclear weapons. It's about increased militarization. It's about the expansion of Nato. It's about all of these issues to do with war. And I think we have to reject what is going on with our governments over this kind of question. If you look at the major things facing us, I think, in terms of war and conflict, we're talking about really 3 areas. We're talking about the new Cold War with China, which is obviously the dominant one. And I see that today the G7 has agreed a supposedly green Belt and Road policy, which is meant to try to rival what China has been doing. We've also seen increased ramping up of tensions over Russia, and it's always worth remembering that the conflict in the Middle East, which supposedly the war on terror was meant to be dealing with, is still there, and in many ways is as deep and intractable as it was 20 years ago. So we have another new enemy that's grown up over the last 20 years in particular is, of course, Iran. We also have the support of the British and American governments in particular, but also the EU governments for Israel's policies, its policies of annexation, of ethnic cleansing, and of occupation of the Palestinian territory. So all of those are issues which I regard as still very, very important for us to be aware of and to campaign around. I'll just put in 2 very quick points to add to this. When we formed Stop the War Coalition 20 years ago, we had as 2 of our demands to resist any attacks on civil liberties and to resist the growth of racism as a result of the war on terror. I think when we look back now, all these years later, we can see that both of these have become exacerbated over the last 20 years. There's far more Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism across the world than there was in 2001. And there's also increasing repression, which I know people in many of the countries represented here have faced in terms of, and we face in Britain in terms of the new policing bill and restrictions on demonstrations of the sort that we've seen in Cornwall. So I think we need to bring all these issues together and to just finally to reiterate that I think that again, as a number of speakers have pointed out, you can't talk about solving the world's problems without looking at how they're connected, to the way in which capital is operating, at the neoliberal system under which we live, and that therefore the solution to wars, to militarization, to climate change, to all of these big issues and many, many more, we have to begin to think much more systematically about how these are linked together and how we fight them as organizations and as a collective in order to bring peace and justice to the world. And just to conclude by saying this, one of the things that's given me great hope for the future has been the huge solidarity movement over Palestine that we've seen in recent weeks. It's certainly been a very, very big issue here in Britain. We've had large demonstrations. We're continuing to have demonstrations around the country and all sorts of other campaigning events and issues connected with it. And I think it's something that we as an international movement have to take up and see as part of our overall campaigning armory. And one of the very encouraging things, and I think this is true internationally, is that it's brought into activity a new generation of sometimes very, very young people who are committed to looking at all these questions and who see all these questions as linked. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much again for inviting me. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsey, for your contribution.